Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's August 8th, 2026. We're going to be talking about the death of free speech in America in particular, and the West more generally. We'll look at the comically egregious ruling in sentencing in the Shiloh Hendrix case, or at least it would be comical if not so consequential for a real woman with a real family, a working class white woman from the Midwest, a heritage American prole, the demographic that globo homo, the powers that be, hate more than any other on the planet, who now, having been targeted by the eye of Sauron, and so now is effectively unemployable and incapable of living with any sort of realistic anonymity in terms of living as a private citizen. That is now effectively off the table for her forever. And it's not as though this was something she went out seeking. Though a large portion of younger cohorts in America aspire to be social media influencers of some type, that is, surveys consistently show among teenagers, that is the most aspired for professional position, such as it is, that they list in surveys. If not outright majorities, then consistently broad pluralities of people want to be influencers. Now even the university systems are trying to get in on the action by offering social media influencer undergraduate degrees, and if that is effective at generating student loan money, then we can expect it will expand beyond the undergraduate to graduate and postgraduate degrees. But despite that being something that a lot of people aspire to, it is an aspiration to something that they are able to entirely cultivate and choreograph to maximize their clicks, their viewership, their following, whatever the case is. That presumably is what these degree programs that universities are beginning to offer are predicated on: how to create and market and maintain a social media presence and to monetize it into a career. But that is not at all what happened to Shiloh Hendrix. She was not looking for attention. She did not want any of this. She clearly had a falling down type of moment, a young mother alone with her toddler, and the toddler is aggressed upon by a child who is several years older, who is taking the child's things, and she engages with the child, and then a grown man gets in her face and starts yelling at her and follows her all the way to her car, pestering her, badgering her to say a racial slur that he repeats over and over again. But on account of being African by ancestry, on account of being Somalian, is something the current year political system and cultural landscape in America permits him to say over and over aggressively at her as he's following her. But when she finally, fed up trying to get into her vehicle and feeling somewhat cornered, says it back to him, well, that is the genesis of the conviction that she received as an outcome of this farce of a trial. There were two charges that she was defending herself against. The first one having to do with the accusation that she called the child who had stolen from her own child, that she'd used a racial slur against him. That charge was dismissed, even though most of the corporate media that reported on the verdict in this trial did so in a way so as to intentionally mislead readers of the story that Shiloh Hendrix was being punished by the law because she yelled racial obscenities at a child. And yet she was acquitted of that charge. The Minnesota Star-Tribune, the largest newspaper in the state where this trial took place, headlined the article reporting on the outcome of the trial thus, quote, "Woman who hurled racial slurs at boy found guilty in Rochester trial," unquote. Well, from a legal perspective, instead entitling the article, "Woman who brushed her teeth in the morning found guilty in Rochester trial" would have been just as legally informative based on what she was actually convicted of, which was disorderly conduct in her engagement with someone named Sharmaik Omar, not even present in the country anymore, which is one of the many obvious, from even this layman's perspective, violation of her constitutional protections to be able to face her accuser at trial, the person who she is being found guilty of aggressing against on a misdemeanor level for disorderly conduct isn't even present in the country. And those disorderly conduct charges were predicated on the fighting words legal doctrine, such as it is, that fighting words rationale. It comes from a case decided all the way back in 1942 entitled Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire. Walter Chaplinsky was a Jehovah's Witness who called a city marshal a, quote, "damn fascist" and a, quote, "damned racketeer," unquote, on a public street in New Hampshire. He was convicted under a New Hampshire statute prohibiting offensive and derisive speech directed at persons in public places. And though the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously upheld the conviction, this is in 1942, so it is happening with the backdrop of World War II raging in the Pacific and in Europe, with the United States fully involved in the war. And yet subsequently, it has been something that the Supreme Court has, in multiple instances of revisiting it, has narrowed again and again the scope of what the ruling applies to, such that it seems to be, at least prior to this railroading conviction of Shiloh Hendrix in Minnesota, it's been something that Supreme Court justices left and right have been embarrassed about. And of course they would have to be. The genesis of this fighting words doctrine, as we just noted, comes from someone calling someone else a fascist. That is something that has become so commonplace in the Western context. It is absurd to think that someone would try with a straight face to maintain the position that calling someone a fascist out in public while they're out in public is a criminal offense, without having to admit that for the better part of the last decade, the justice system and the legal system have been totally, entirely broken and unwilling to anything about fighting words being employed in situations much more likely to become kinetic, to devolve into violence, even death, than was remotely conceivable back in 1942 when Chaplinsky was found guilty. Here, for example, is the audio of a large group of people at a public university aggressively screaming those fighting words over and over and over again at a single individual.
Fuck these fascists! 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 Fuck these fascists!
That spectacle has been everywhere, at every public speaking event that someone, even a milquetoast Republican, someone considered politically moderate, but vaguely associated with being on the right or political conservatism in some way, and increasingly even those corporate democratic leftists who are viewed as being too amenable to America's support for Israel and the Middle East. Even those putatively who hold themselves forward as being on the left, but who are a Zionist in their orientation, are subjected to this sort of verbal attack on a regular basis. It's been everywhere in American politics for over a decade. Prior to that, for decades previously, but has become totally ubiquitous in the last 10 years. In political context. So the idea that somehow those specific words being uttered form the basis for this fighting words doctrine that now Shiloh Hendrix is being convicted for 70 years after the fact, when in those intervening 70 years it's never been used to convict anyone of anything, gives lie to the idea that this is legally justifiable in any way, or that is the intention here, to have some sort of real serious trial where evidence is presented and the case is objectively adjudicated by a blind lady justice. This is obviously a persecution. Shiloh Hendrix is being persecuted and was prosecuted for violating blasphemy laws. And the clerisy of Globo Homo needs to ensure that Shiloh Hendrix pays dearly for her blaspheming. It has nothing to do with free speech, the question of free speech, and whether or not these so-called fighting words violate protections that the First Amendment and that free speech in the American cultural and political landscape generally is perceived to protect. And I'm going to play some of the reaction from the verdict being rendered by Shiloh Hendrix's defense attorney to convey how much of a farce the idea that this is some legal procedure having to do with constitutional protections is laid out in the Bill of Rights, and instead show that this is clearly a persecution of one of the remaining barbarians inside the gates of the Globo Homo Empire.
So we're going to appeal it. We will appeal it. We have so many appellate issues, I don't even know where to begin. Judges screaming at me during the trial. Judges interrupting me every time I want to make a record. Judge says to me, Mr. Corrales, you keep wanting to make a record after I rule. This is crazy. Most rulings during a trial by a judge are made during the trial. And then when you take a break, you make a record, right? You take a break, you make a record. I kept asking. If you're in there and you watch the trial, I kept asking. I need to make a record. I need to make a record. She'd get upset, run in the back. Get upset, run in the back. Your Honor, I need to make a record. It started piling up. All these objections started piling up. Your Honor, I need to make a record. I need to make a record. She'd run in the back. I'm like, Judge, we got to make a record. This is insane. This isn't law. This is a circus. This is monkey court. This is nuts. Right? You make a record. The judge should come out and say, okay, I made my ruling. Mr. Corrales, what is your record you like to make? I try to make a record. She interrupts me from the beginning. Right from the start. Every time I tried to make a record, she interrupted me. Every single time. Every single time. I'm like, Your Honor, I'm trying to make a record. That's what we do as lawyers, right? I don't know if the lay people or the people in the community understand this. The way trials work is judges make rulings during trial. We don't want to interrupt the trial to make a record every time someone objects. And there's a ruling. So when there's a break or you go to lunch or at the end of the day, you make a record. She wouldn't let me make a record. If you're in there, you heard it. She'd talk over me. She'd interrupt me. Wouldn't let me make a record. Over and over and over again. Why? She didn't want anybody to hear what? They didn't disclose the name of Shire Jamali until Monday. The first day of trial. No, I'm not done. Sorry. Until the first day of trial, they didn't even disclose his name. Think about that. A jury trial in the United States of America. I didn't get the name until Monday. When we started the trial, until Monday. And then my investigators do a record check. Then we uncover, oh my God, he's got this GoFundMe. $340,000.
Mr. Corrales, a couple of things.
Sure.
According to the court, you agreed to those pre-trial terms about not getting the witnesses beforehand and...
Did not agree to it. Here's the deal. I thought I was coming down here to try a free speech case. You all saw the video. I thought I was coming to Rochester to try a free speech case based on the video. Then it took on an entirely different, it just turned, right? Mr. Jamali takes the stand. Wouldn't answer any question I asked him. He sat there like this. Oh, I don't understand. He looked at his interpreter. I don't understand. I don't understand. Over and over and over again. When the prosecutor asked him a question, he had no problem through the interpreter understanding. Never had a problem understanding. Not one time. I put the detective on the stand. Detective, did he ever have a tough time understanding you? Never had a tough time understanding him. Never had a tough time. Not one time did the detective have any problems understanding. You were in the jury room or in the trial. You were in the courtroom. You were in the courtroom. You're in the courtroom. He acted like he didn't understand any question I asked him. Every single question was like pulling teeth. It's like, huh? Well, it went on and on and on. This is a fraud. This whole thing's a fraud. The cameraman. By the way, let's make something clear. They didn't convict him with the child. Your headlines could be about the child. No, they convicted her on the video with the cameraman. The disorderly conduct is about the cameraman.
Right.
And from what I understand about the cameraman, he has a GoFundMe. And his GoFundMe, his GoFundMe is he died. He has a GoFundMe that he died. Give money to the cameraman who died. And from what I understand, he's well alive. This whole thing is fucking bullshit.
Mr. Corrales.
This is a fraud. This is a fraud upon the community. The courts are now part of this. Keep going. Come on, bring it on.
Mr.
What else?
Corrales, what about Miss Hendrix' gifts and go, where she got, from what I understand...
Don't care. Not part of the trial. That's not part of the trial. She's charged with a crime. I don't give a shit about what she raised. There are free speech advocates all around America that are tired of this shit. And they gave her a bunch of money because they're tired of this shit.
Mr. Corrales.
You suggested that Jamali was testifying for money during the trial, or that he was doing this for financial gains.
Okay, I'll give you another one. Okay, you ready for this? You ready for this one? He pretends he doesn't speak English. We have him on fucking video, on camera, pictures, sitting out right where you people are sitting, talking to the prosecutors. The two prosecutors talking to him right where you're sitting. No interpreter. Talking for minutes. No interpreter. No interpreter. He speaks English, folks. This is a fraud. But keep going. Let's go. What else?
I got two follow-ups. One,
Yep, keep going.
I was wondering.
And you're not going to put in your paper or whatever thing you're part of. You're all part of the shakedown. This media is BS bullshit. Then print the truth. Print the truth. The judge refused to allow the jury to see the GoFundMe page. Print the truth.
You said...
print the truth.
Of course, sir. You said earlier...
Print it.
I will do so as soon as I can ask you some
How do you
questions.
know that-
Can we first talk a little bit about your conduct in the courtroom? You were a little combative at times, and you spoke to the jury.
I'm taking on a lot of BS. So
Yeah, and you spoke to the jury, and you were talking about how passionate you get.
Yep.
When you talk,
and
about
if you were
all
in
these
trouble,
issues-
you would want me.
Would you let him ask the question?
You're not going to tell me what to do. If you want to tell me what to do, go over there.
And so when you were trying this case, it seemed like this was pretty frustrating. Is this kind of par for the course when you defend?
No. This was the most unprofessional circus I've ever been a part of.
Another question. I believe Mr. Jamali's first name was Sheree.
Whatever it
Did you
is.
catch that earlier?
Don't care. You
Okay.
can correct it. I don't know.
Well, no, I was just wondering if you had caught it earlier.
Oh, did I say it wrong? Print that. I
No.
said his name wrong.
I was just
Go with that one.
What? I was just wondering.
Did
if
I
you
say
caught it earlier.
Shire? I didn't say
I
Sheree. Print that. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No. It wasn't an accusation or anything. I was just wondering
Okay.
if you had noted that.
Yep.
The other thing, you said that you were going to be filing an appeal for
Absolutely.
this. How soon do you plan on filing?
There
an
are
appeal?
so many appellate issues. This was one of the craziest trials I've ever seen. I would text colleagues of mine, lawyer friends of mine, tell them what was going on. No one could believe what was going on. This is insane. This is insane.
Is there anything else you think we should know or that people should
Oh,
know
the
about this case?
prosecutor pretending he never saw the GoFundMe page in Rochester? From what I understand, I'm not from here. I didn't know anything about this. Everyone knew about this. And he's arguing that this is an authentic. Okay.
Well,
Oh, okay. If this is authentic, the GoFundMe page isn't authentic, he argued. We don't know where this came from. The judge says, oh, anyone could have made this up. Anybody could have made this up. Really? Okay, go with that. Write that one down. Ask the community, because they're going to laugh at you people.
that was
They're already sick of the media. They're tired of it. They don't believe anything you people say. They don't believe anything you people print. Yeah, go with that.
That was one of the issues in the court, was an argument over just courtroom procedures and courtroom rules. What was your perspective on kind of getting shut down a few times when you were trying to introduce that evidence that the judge and the
The
prosecutor
judge
said
said
that
Rule
you were-
901 of the Rules of Evidence only applies to prosecutors. You were there. I mean, come on. Come on. Look it up. Do a little Google search. Do some work. Learn the law. Do an actual job. You're in the media. Look it up. Rule 901. Judge, that's a prosecutor's rule. No, it isn't. No, it is not. That rule applies to both sides.
Did your client show any remorse after getting out of the courtroom today regarding the statement by the NAACP president about the impact that this incident had on the community as a whole? Not
You asked me this before. This is for you people. This is a clown show.
This was an immediate reaction after the verdict. The lawyer here hasn't had time to systematically gather his thoughts, and there are a lot of assumptions he's making about the knowledge of general trial proceedings that he's taking for granted. And so his articulation of the farcical nature of the trial probably doesn't come across as clearly as it will on appeal. At least that's the assessment I'm making, and that does somewhat contradict the perhaps hyperbolic assertion made previously about how the crime here is blaspheming the religion of Globo Homo, and that antiquated ideas of freedom of speech and constitutional protections of personal liberties will provide no meaningful defense against the figurative burning of Shiloh Hendrix at the stake. There's a realistic chance that even if this makes it out of appellate courts at the state level, that it gets all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and that the charge is overturned on this misdemeanor count of disorderly conduct, although Shiloh Hendrix will have already performed her hundreds of hours of community service. I guess she'll get restitution for the fine that she'll have to pay if things shake out that way. But the more remarkable consequence of that will be that I predict, if things play out that way and the conviction is overturned, that it will be used as a catalyst by Globo Homo to consolidate further the cultural hegemony that allowed this persecution of Hendrix to happen in the first place. That's really what I want to focus on here, is not so much the farcical nature of the case, the fact that a white heritage American working class prole is being ground into dust because she snapped after first her child was bullied in Minnesota, the place of Lake Wobegon, the state that Time magazine criticized decades ago for being 99% white, for being so placid, so peaceful, the kind of place where it was utterly taken for granted that a mother could take her toddler to a playground and the toddler could play without being accosted. And if an older child did accost her younger child and she intervened, that there would be some understanding by the parents of the other child, and they would civilly work it out so that no children were bullied. But instead, what happened with Shiloh Hendrix is after her less than 2-year-old son was bullied by a Somali child who was 8 when the mother intervened and tried to get her, when Shiloh intervened and tried to get her son out of that situation, then she was bullied by a fully grown adult man who followed her to her vehicle as she was trying to leave. And so it's not so much that, which is more a consequence of this underlying change in ultimately in the demographic composition of the United States, that has played a not insignificant role in changing the cultural understanding that free speech is a principle worth protecting, a principle worth permitting citizens to have access to, because it is not the norm across human history. It is the exception, the idea that people have the right to express themselves. It is a concept born out of Northwestern European societies in general and forged and distilled more greatly still in America in particular. And so as Heritage America goes away and the great replacement of the Third World into the U.S. proceeds apace, that a natural casualty of this, among many other casualties, will be the idea that free speech is even a valid concept rather than just some sort of prevaricating nonsense offered by people who are justifiably being punished for the things that they said that they shouldn't have said and that they know they shouldn't have said. Before we get into the General Social Survey, which is the metric we'll use to look at how free speech as a value is dying in America, that all of the demographic trends are working against it as a concept to be maintained, as a principle to be put forward as something that should be aspired to, rather than, as mentioned previously, as a sort of shield for nefarious actors, for dissidents and barbarians to try to hide behind as they engage in blasphemous acts against the High Temple of Globo Homo. Before we get into the details of that, it is worth understanding that this is a relatively new development even amongst the managerial class. The rise of the internet and the ability to go around the traditional gatekeepers of cultural shaping opinions definitely play a role, a significant role, but there is also a bottom-up phenomenon happening here where the drive to shut down free speech isn't just coming from the managerial class, from Globo Homo trying to shut down dissidents. It is also organically being demanded by those being waved in by the managerial elite from places outside of the historic Western world. That is, the invaders who are coming in from Latin America and Africa and subcontinental Asia and the Middle East. All of these populations don't need Globo Homo to instruct them on how they're supposed to feel about free speech. They inherently already want it shut down. So it is a particularly pernicious example of the top and the bottom closing in on the middle. But to get back to how this is a relatively new development in Western society and in America in particular, in 1977, the Supreme Court of the U.S. upheld a ruling from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in a case entitled The Village of Skokie versus the National Socialist Party of America that permitted a neo-Nazi group to hold a public rally in a disproportionately Jewish suburb outside of Chicago, and leading the successful defense of the neo-Nazis' right to hold that protest was the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, an organization very much held in high esteem, very much a managerial state organization that went to the mat to defend the right of Nazis to speak freely in public in America. It's unthinkable that the ACLU would take a similar position today, barely more than a generation after this Skokie ruling. The ACLU would be apologizing for putting a picture of a young blonde white girl holding an American flag in some innocuous post about the importance of personal freedoms being protected in America. The reverence that used to be reserved for the concept of free speech has today been replaced by a zeal to persecute those who utter hate speech, which can be described clichély, although accurately, as speech that those doing the persecuting hate. That is what constitutes hate speech. And the idea that speech that those in power dislike, cultural power, political power, or otherwise dislike, are able to use to shut up those purveying that speech, well, that is the crux of what makes free speech what it is. It's not anodyne, non-controversial speech that doesn't challenge any existing power structure or sense of etiquette or anything else. The thing free speech is protecting is exactly that speech which is viewed negatively by those who wish to restrict the speech, as illustrated by the ACLU, a disproportionately Jewish organization working to defend Nazis' rights to speak publicly in disproportionately Jewish areas. That is what free speech historically was understood as, and what, to its credit or otherwise, and I know many in the Dark Enlightenment, neo-reactionary thought, of which I am well acquainted and broadly sympathetic, I understand that a defense of free speech is often something that is criticized. The idea that free speech is a virtue instead of a problem coming out of the Enlightenment that caused so many other problems. That for better or worse, Globo Homo, the managerial states, up until the last couple of decades, really the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, free speech really was something, for whatever reason, the Globo Homo defended and protected and gave credence to the idea of. Twitter in the early 2010s was described by Jack Dorsey and other Twitter executives as the, quote, free speech wing of the free speech movement, unquote. For more than the first 10 years of YouTube's existence, everything outside of personal calls for illegal, violent activities to be perpetrated against individuals, everything beyond that was permitted. Nothing was censored. Nothing seemed even to be shadow banned. The VC Silicon Valley understanding of American values very much inside the bounds of the managerial state, of what the managerial state accepted and propagated at the time, very much inside of those parameters was the understanding that free speech was a value, was a virtue, was something worth protecting and promoting. I think we can mark the start of the change away from that as beginning distinctly with Obama's second election in 2012. And then, of course, really ramping up after Trump's first election in 2016. And so it is with 2012 as a starting point through to the present. I want to turn now to the General Social Survey, which has, year after year, iteration after iteration, has asked a question that very much gets to the heart of the idea of free speech as a value and as a principle or a concept worth maintaining. The question asked to respondents is, quote, consider a person who believes that black people are genetically inferior. If such a person wanted to make a speech in your community claiming that black people are inferior, should he be allowed to speak or not? Unquote. This is the Skokie question put to the masses, and probably a better distillation of the essence of free speech underlying the question being asked than even Skokie, particularly post October 7th and Israel's response to Palestine, the ethnic cleansing and destruction that is taking place in and around the Levant that has understandably led to a demotion in Jews as a protected class above any sort of criticism. Prior to October 7th of 2023, it was an open question, or at least an arguable question, as to what was the greater act of blasphemy, to criticize Jews or to criticize blacks. But now I think it is perceived as a more widely understood act of unrepentant blasphemy to criticize blacks, even more so than Jews. And so this general social survey question serves as a great proxy for underlying support for the idea of free speech as a concept. And the time frame from 2012 to the present serves as a useful time frame for understanding the current cultural zeitgeist and political landscape. And so support using this metric, these parameters, for free speech among whites is 61%, among blacks 51%, among American Indians 47%, among Asians 43%, and among Hispanics 39%. What will jump out immediately to the astute observer of human action is that after whites, blacks are the most likely to assent to the idea of someone coming into their community and publicly talking about how blacks in particular are genetically inferior. The question asks about allowing a racist to speak rather than a racialist. In the view of most people, that's going to be a distinction without a difference. You might think your empirically grounded description of human biodiversity and the evolutionary pressures that have shaped the way that groups have acted over time and the selection pressures acting on them and how that manifests in different behavioral tendencies and capacities is going to be interpreted by most people generally and everyone in good standing in the managerial state in positions of power among all of the elites as indistinguishable from asserting that blacks are just outright genetically inferior to everyone else, especially to whites. And so I don't think the results would change much if the hypothetical speaker was Steve Saylor versus the jackbooted thug screaming the N-word that the question asked by the GSS elicits in the minds of most responders to this question. But to the extent that there is some distinction made between those approaches, well, this question is asking it in a way that would give the most leeway for blacks in particular to answer in opposition to allowing such a person to speak while still plausibly maintaining some adherence, some devotion to the idea of free speech. And yet, even in what would presumably be perceived as the most egregious sort of speech that could be made from a black person's perspective, still an outright majority, barely, but an outright majority of blacks respond that such a person should be permitted to speak, and that American Indians are the next most free speech supportive group, and that Asians and Hispanics are cooler to the idea of free speech, hints at what the real great divide here is, and how the demographic transformation is destroying free speech. And that is because it is an American value, a distinctly American value, broadly a Western value, but in particular a very American value that until very recently was not a partisan political issue. It was something Americans of all political and cultural persuasions broadly took for granted as something worthy of respect and protection. The apocryphal Voltaire quote about hating what you say, but defending to the death your right to say it was something that could have just as easily come out of a Democrat's mouth as a Republican's mouth, a Southerner's mouth or a Northerner's mouth, a black man's mouth or a white woman's mouth. So no reason to beat around the bush any further, asking the question and looking at results by birthplace, whether or not the respondent was born in the United States. Those born in America, 58% support free speech. A figure that in political terms and electoral terms would be an absolute landslide compared to less than 40%, just 39% of those born outside the U.S. supporting free speech. Put succinctly, Americans support free speech, immigrants do not. And this despite the fact that, as we've talked about when we looked at the World Values Survey in a previous recording, that Americans are way less likely to say that they'd have a problem with someone of a different race living next to them than are the residents of Mexico or India or Nigeria. And so even though Americans are less, quote, racist, unquote, than immigrants are, they are also a lot more tolerant of racist speech than immigrants are, which is just another way of saying or underscoring, emphasizing the fact that free speech is a uniquely American value. If we're a proposition nation, then free speech is one of the most important propositions. And you'll have trouble finding someone more attuned to the realities of human biodiversity than me, and yet there is an undeniable cultural element to this. Yes, there is something to be said about the idealization of free speech as a venerable, laudable virtue to pursue and protect coming out of outbred people of Northwestern European descent in Christendom, and taking that value and allowing it to flourish and trying to universalize it. But there is also something to be said about the efficacy of doing so and it taking with populations that wouldn't generate the idea of free speech as being something worthy of protecting and celebrating, if not shown that, if not having that inculcated in their own cultural understanding in the way that America has, again, up until recently, been able to promote and protect. And we can see this quite starkly by looking at the GSS just at Hispanics and separating Hispanic respondents out by whether or not they were born in the United States or outside of the U.S. Are they second generation plus or first generation immigrant? Among Hispanics born in the U.S., 47% support free speech compared to just 31% of immigrant Hispanics. And a similar dynamic with Asians, with 49% of those born in the U.S. supporting free speech compared to just 40% born outside of the U.S. In contrast to the stark differences by native versus immigrant, the differences are relatively marginal by political orientation. Among self-described conservatives, 60% support free speech compared to 55% of political liberals and 52% of political moderates. But even that 5-point spread between conservatives and liberals is predominantly a consequence of immigrants being more likely to describe as liberal politically than natives are. If we just look at American-born liberals, 57% support free speech, compared to just 43% of liberal immigrants. While the starkest distinction in support for free speech is between native-born Americans and immigrants, there is a marginal divide by political orientation, a modest divide by race, and also a comparatively modest divide by sex, in a way that will surprise no one who is honest about human biodiversity and has an understanding that women tend towards conformity, social cohesion for very understandable evolutionary reasons, while men display a more natural tolerance for potentially objectionable or controversial ideas. Tracing all the way back to hunter and gatherer roots, men are out doing battle with the world and bringing back resources for the tribe, and so have to be brutally honest with one another about who's most intimidating to charge the mammoth from the front and who has the best accuracy to spear the mammoth from the side, while women run a more collectivist shop back home, ensuring that there isn't unnecessary conflict between two mothers who are going to do a lot of shared child rearing for each other's sons and daughters. And so, support for free speech among men, 60% compared to 50% for women. One of the criticisms of the Great Replacement is that the populations coming in to the U.S. tend to be less intelligent than the population already present in the country. As migrants from countries with lower average IQs come into the West, the average IQ of the Western populations will correspondingly tend to decline. That carries with it a whole host of consequences and externalities for the receiving population. One of those consequences, though, has to do with free speech. If we look at support for free speech just among those born in the U.S., so taking out the immigrant aspect to just look at the association between intelligence and support for free speech, we turn to the word sum test given in the General Social Survey, which is a 10-question vocabulary test that serves as a decent proxy for intelligence. In fact, word sum correlates with IQ results at a 0.71 correlation, which is pretty strong for the social sciences. Really, anything above 0.6 is considered robust. Among those in the roughly lowest tertile of intelligence as measured by word sum, support for free speech comes in at 50%. Among those in the middle tertile, 59%, and those at the top tertile, the most intelligent, at 66%. Intelligence and support for free speech go hand in hand. And the last broad demographic category we'll use to look at differences in support for free speech will be generational. Among boomers, support for free speech comes in at 57%. Among Xers, who are in fact the most supportive of free speech, it comes in at 60%. Very much in line with the general perceptions, generational perceptions in America, where Xers are the generation that came of age with the internet and the idea that the opportunities, the potential for what that meant in terms of spreading ideas and concepts and understandings and engaging with those ideas in constructive ways. That is something that very much defines the Gen X experience in America. And it's borne out here, even in the General Social Survey, with respect to the idea that even speech that is viewed unfavorably in a cultural or political sense should still be protected, should still be permitted. Among millennials, it drops off to 52%. One of the most pernicious ideas I'm fond of criticizing about the Harry Potter series and the phenomenon that was among millennials coming of age a generation ago was the idea that Voldemort couldn't be named, and the idea of casting spells, of saying particular words, and these syllables coming out of people's mouths having real world physical effects, significant effects often that would dwarf any physical actions that the purveyors of those syllables could make happen by way of their own physical prowess. And so with the ascension of Harry Potter to dominate much of popular culture in the early parts of the 2000s, was the inversion of the idea, the aphorism that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words would never hurt me. Harry Potter turned that on its head, and it became, yeah, maybe sticks and stones can hurt a little bit, but words are way, way, way more hurtful, way more likely to crush people or save them than sticks and stones could possibly do. But the Harry Potterization of society, such as it is, has taken more among the subsequent generation following millennials than millennials themselves. Among Zoomers, just 42% support free speech. Parenthetically, in case I haven't made the analogy previously here, since we're on the topic of Harry Potter and also the topic of free speech and how immigration influences American conceptions of free speech, and how as heritage Americans are replaced by migrants from outside of the Western world, outside of America, free speech also is getting replaced. I think more than anything else, immigration is the golden snitch. Another reason Harry Potter got my goad when I was growing up comes from my interest in game design, and the main sport, such as it is in the Harry Potter Hogwarts world, is something called Quidditch. A game kinda sorta like lacrosse but played on flying broomsticks, which, okay, conceptually could work like an airborne version of, say, Blitzball in Final Fantasy X, which was a perfectly designed game from a game design standpoint. But the problem with Quidditch is that there isn't a time frame, and there are points awarded to catching these balls that fly around. But none of the balls, except for the golden snitch, are worth anything, hardly anything. I forget what the exact points are, but it's like the golden snitch is worth like orders of magnitude more than these other balls, and whenever somebody catches the golden snitch, the game ends. But the golden snitch is worth 150 points, whereas these other balls are worth like 5 or 10 points. And so the obvious strategy is to allow the other team to chase these balls that are worth 5 or 10 points, and your team focuses all of its energy on catching this golden snitch. And as soon as you do so, it doesn't matter if they caught 10 of the other balls. You got the only one that mattered. You get the 150 points. The game ends, and you win. And so from a game design standpoint, it's terrible. It would be like if soccer took place, there was regulation, and goals traditionally scored were worth 1 point, but then at the end of the game, there was, irrespective of the score in regulation, there was a shootout, except the goals scored in the shootout were worth 50 points compared to the goals scored in regulation. And so you would just rest your players up for the shootout at the end. You let the opposing team run up and down the field and maybe score 5, 10, 15 goals even, which is an extraordinarily high score for soccer. And yet it wouldn't matter, because it would behoove you, instead of expending any effort unnecessarily or potentially contracting an injury in regulation, you would save all of your energy, all of your freshness, all of your tactical acuity for the shootout at the end, because everything else didn't matter. That is the golden snitch, and that is, in a lot of ways, the immigration question in terms of understanding America's future and the propositions that are important to ourselves and our posterity going into that future. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.